The jet lifted from Dubrovnik's runway with an ease that betrayed the tension in the air. It was meant to be a simple midnight flight to Zurich, a quiet end to a coastal investigation recently closed by Hercule Poirot and myself, Captain Hastings. But almost instantly, Poirot's brow furrowed beneath the gentle hum of the engines. He sat unnaturally still in his first-class seat, fingertips pressed together, eyes scanning the cabin. Not an idle observation, but with the unmistakable vigilance of a man sensing something out of place. "This is not a restful journey, mon ami," he whispered. "There's a silence in this cabin that listens too carefully, too purposefully." The passengers, only 8 of us in the forward cabin, seemed mismatched, as if chosen not by chance, but design. A soft-spoken botanist, Dr. Ilse Bren, clutched a fraying satchel on her lap, her eyes darting towards the windows as if she feared what might appear beyond them. A retired orchestral conductor, Mr. Alders, trembled subtly as he traced invisible notes on the tray before him. In the row across from us sat a young man in clerical robes. Silent except for the Latin phrases he scrawled into a weathered notebook. And then there was the woman in midnight blue attire, Kira Lang, wearing dark sunglasses in a cabin lit only by the soft glow of reading lights. She sat composed, too composed, sipping mineral water as if she were in the lounge of a spy novel. Poirot turned his attention to the steward, who maneuvered the drink cart with practiced efficiency. The steward's eyes lingered too long on seat 9B, where a stout man in a pinstripe suit sat unusually upright, Otto Weiss, a defense consultant whose name had recently surfaced in hushed diplomatic briefings. I recognized him immediately, though we had never met. As the aircraft climbed above the Adriatic, a subtle unease crept over me too, not the kind born from turbulence, but from the unnatural stillness of a room just before a lie is told. Poirot adjusted his napkin without looking down, then whispered again, "This flight is not merely a means of travel, Hastings. It is a corridor, a closed one, and tonight someone aboard intends to walk it unseen." Outside, the sky swallowed the last of the coastline. The cabin lights dimmed, and somewhere, in the dark divide between origin and destination, something began to unravel, quietly, precisely, and without mercy. It began 32 minutes after takeoff, just as we reached cruising altitude above the dark folds of the Dalmatian coast. The silence of the cabin was interrupted not by a scream, nor a scuffle, but by absence. A disappearance so surgically clean it seemed, at first, an error. The stewardess, making her second round through business class, paused by seat 9B. "Sir," she said gently, but there was no reply. The man who had been seated there, Otto Weiss, was gone. At first, we assumed he had gone to the lavatory, but both lavatories were unoccupied. A check of the galley, then a more thorough sweep of the cabin, followed. Nothing. He had not passed anyone in the aisle. The cabin door remained locked. His seatbelt, oddly, still hung fastened. It was impossible. Poirot rose with a fluid grace, gesturing for the stewardess to step back. "No one disappears midair, mademoiselle," he said quietly, "unless they are meant to." He knelt beside the vacant seat and examined the surrounding floor. I followed his gaze. Weiss's carry-on bag remained tucked neatly beneath the seat, zipped, untouched. Poirot unfastened the overhead compartment. Still locked, still full, nothing out of place. It was as if the man had never boarded at all. But then came the detail that changed everything. The steward, returning from the rear lavatory, held something in his hand, a torn passport, its pages wet and half-flushed, discovered in the lavatory basin. Weiss's name was visible on the cover. Inside, the identifying photo had been ripped out. 3 jagged pieces of a national identity shredded and half-submerged in a metallic bowl, abandoned mid-disposal. Poirot examined the remnants with gloved hands. "This," he murmured, "is not escape. This is erasure." The pilot was informed immediately. Security protocols were raised, but at 30,000 feet. Protocols only meant delay. We were locked in a metal coffin, suspended in air, with no one in and no one out. The tension among the passengers turned palpable. Kira Lang remained motionless in her seat, adjusting her sunglasses, without expression. The conductor, Mr. Alders, spilled his drink and didn't notice. The cleric crossed himself, then began to scribble faster in his notebook. Poirot requested the seating chart and cross-referenced the manifest. 9 passengers, he said softly. And now, only 8 visible. But the key is not who has vanished, but who is pretending they didn't want him to. He looked out the window, into the ink-black stretch of night sky, then turned to me. This, Hastings, he said, is no vanishing trick. It is a subtraction. Clean, deliberate, and unforgiving. And somewhere in that sealed, humming cabin, someone listened, knowing what they had done, and knowing we had begun to see it. By the time the captain stabilized the flight path and locked the cockpit door with reinforced command, a strange silence had settled over the cabin. Not the kind bred by fear alone, but something more, a silence of calculation. I glanced around as passengers avoided each other's eyes, their gazes fixed on seatbelt signs and in-flight magazines, as if the printed page could offer absolution. Poirot, however, had already selected his first conversation. Dr. Ilse Bren, a wiry woman in her late 50s with sharp cheekbones, thin lips, and a satchel she guarded with the possessiveness of a mother cradling a child, sat in seat 7A, just 2 rows ahead of the vanished man. I believe, madam, Poirot said gently, approaching with respectful posture, that you were seated nearest to Mr. Weiss. Did you notice anything unusual? She did not meet his eyes, only that he ordered a gin with no ice. Odd, given how warm the cabin was. Poirot inclined his head, and after that, a noise, she said. Around midnight. A thump. Not loud, but not mechanical either. I assumed someone dropped something in the galley. I didn't look back. Was he speaking with anyone during the flight? I don't believe so, she replied, her voice tightening. He kept to himself, as did I. Poirot's gaze drifted to her satchel, a rugged, reinforced canvas pouch marked with customs tags from Montenegro and Albania. He gently gestured toward it. You travel with field equipment? I am a botanist, she answered curtly. I'm returning from an expedition, soil analysis in the Komovi Range. May I? Poirot asked. She hesitated, then slowly unbuckled the straps. Inside were vials of earth samples, sealed in sterile containers. A few seed specimens, notes scribbled in shorthand, and one object that did not seem to belong. A white envelope with faded pencil markings, its corners creased as though handled frequently. Poirot slipped it out and examined it. A string of handwritten numbers and letters lined the edge. 43.0817 degrees north, 19.6530 degrees east. He looked up. These are coordinates, he said. Ilse nodded, then leaned closer. It's a location in the mountains. A site my team discovered years ago, never recorded. Some believe it predates Illyrian settlement. We found spores in the soil that don't match anything known. Fascinating, Poirot murmured. And what does Otto Weiss have to do with it? She went very still. Nothing, she said finally. At least, not directly. But I suspected. He might have had interest in the location. Military interest. Poirot folded the envelope and returned it to her bag with meticulous care. Thank you, Doctor, he said. But I wonder, in your scientific work, have you encountered flora that appears extinct, only to return when the conditions are right? Of course, she replied. Dormancy is nature's camouflage. Poirot nodded. Indeed, the same may be said of guilt, madam. It lies buried until disturbed. As we moved back toward our seats, I glanced behind us. Dr. Bren was no longer looking at her satchel. She was staring, unblinking, at the lavatory door, the same one where Otto Weiss's shredded identity had begun to surface. And Poirot, returning to his seat, whispered to me. She hears echoes, Hastings, the kind that grow louder the higher we climb. The engines hummed like distant thunder as the aircraft pierced through the Atlantic night, trailing a silver breath against a black sky. Inside the dimmed cabin, Steward Andrews poured tea, the cups rattling faintly with the turbulence. Yet the stillest of them all, utterly motionless save for the delicate flicker of his pen, was the young man in clerical garb seated in 3D. Father Domenech. He hadn't spoken since takeoff. Not a word. Instead, he scribbled continuously into a slim, leather-bound notebook that never left his side. Poirot had been watching him for some time, eyes narrowed not with suspicion, but with a quiet sense of foreboding, as if the priest's silence was the loudest voice aboard. As I accompanied Poirot, we made our way down the aisle. Father Domenech glanced up briefly as we approached, but did not greet us. Poirot gave a polite bow. "Forgive the intrusion, mon père," he said softly, "but your devotion to the written word, it intrigues me. Might I ask what you record with such dedication?" The priest hesitated, fingers tightening around the notebook. Then, almost reluctantly, he closed it. "It is a penance," he said, his voice low and brittle. "Names, places, sins of others, things I was told in confidence years ago." Poirot tilted his head. "Confessions." Domenech shook his head. "Not in the sacramental sense. These were not confessions offered for redemption. These were secrets, meant never to be spoken again." "And yet you write them? Someone must remember." Poirot's tone darkened. "And Otto Weiss. Did you remember him?" The priest froze, not in fear, but in revelation. "I didn't expect you to ask that name." Poirot gestured to the notebook. "May I?" The priest did not resist, but there was a weight to his consent. Poirot opened the book to a seemingly random page. His eyes scanned the lines with increasing interest. Then he stopped. Scrawled in ink beside the year 1989 were the words, "Weiss Otto, Delilah Protocol." My heart quickened. I glanced at Poirot. He closed the book gently, reverently, and handed it back. "What is the Delilah Protocol?" he asked. The priest's face was pale now. "A code," he said, "from the Balkan operations. NATO archives. It was meant to erase the past. Target select individuals, operatives, defectors, ghosts, people with knowledge too dangerous to live." And Weiss, he escaped the program, disappeared. But if he was on this flight, then someone has remembered. And that, Domenech whispered, means the list is awake again. Poirot nodded slowly. "The past, mon père, never dies. It merely sleeps, until altitude shakes it from its slumber." We returned to our seats as the cabin lights flickered once more, as if acknowledging the name spoken aloud. Otto Weiss was not simply a man with enemies. He had been a thread pulled from a frayed tapestry, and now the entire weave was unraveling midair. And Poirot, eyes narrowed toward the sealed lavatory door, murmured, "They are not hunting a man, Hastings. They are silencing a history." The hum of the engines deepened as we soared further west, the dark horizon lined with the faintest glimmer of moonlight. The passengers, uneasy but obedient, had settled into a hush that carried its own weight. Poirot remained seated for a time, studying the passenger manifest in his lap, while I watched the figure seated just 3 rows ahead of us. The woman in midnight blue. She was striking, not for beauty, though she had that, but for her stillness. Her name, according to the manifest, was Kira Lang. She had boarded late, spoke to no one, and wore sunglasses even in the dimmed cabin light. And she watched everything. Poirot finally rose and approached her, with the politeness of a man offering tea rather than inquiry. "Madam," he said gently, "you have the air of someone who has seen this before, not the crime, but the pattern that leads to it." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slid her sunglasses down her nose just enough for Poirot to see her eyes, cold, slate gray, like ice that's never melted. She studied him for a long moment, then motioned to the empty seat across from her. Poirot sat. "I never worked directly with Weiss," she said, her voice smooth and controlled. "But we were in the same rooms. During transitions." "Transitions?" Poirot repeated, arching an eyebrow. She smiled faintly. "Power changes shape. Countries change names. Men change loyalties. Weiss, he didn't just hold secrets. He was one. And you? I was once tasked with knowing what people were willing to pay to forget. That is an expensive business." Poirot folded his hands. "So why are you on this flight?" Kira shrugged. "Because he reached out to me. Weiss, he said he had the final piece of the map. I didn't believe him. But if he did, if he truly had it, then others would follow. And they wouldn't be content with conversation." Poirot nodded slowly. "And so he died." "He was already dead," she said. He just didn't realize how many graves he'd built with paper. I leaned forward. You speak as if you knew this would happen. I didn't plan it, she said flatly. But I knew it would happen eventually. Men like Weiss, they carry too many vaults in their heads. Eventually someone breaks in. Poirot regarded her quietly. You speak of him with no malice, but also no mourning. I respect the dead, she said, even those who betrayed me. Poirot stood. Thank you, Madame Lang, and forgive the intrusion. As we walked away, I whispered, Do you believe her? Poirot's gaze remained on the back of her head. I believe she speaks only what she chooses to. But yes, she is not the hand that struck. She is the lock, and Weiss was the key. Then Poirot glanced toward the galley freezer, his eyes narrowing. And sometimes, when the key turns in too many locks, Monsieur Hastings, something shatters. And with that, he turned back to his notebook, the pattern forming more clearly now in the mind that never missed a step, even at 40,000 feet. The night sky stretched infinitely beyond the cabin windows, an endless veil of ink spattered with quiet stars. Somewhere over the Atlantic, while most passengers had retreated into shallow sleep or feigned calm, Poirot's mind was more alert than ever. He sat perfectly composed, the broken remains of Otto Weiss's passport arranged like puzzle pieces on the tray table before him. No man, he said softly, destroys his identity mid-flight unless he intends to replace it or erase it entirely. I leaned closer. You think he intended to disappear? Poirot gave a slight nod, but his eyes remained on the torn document. But he did not vanish, Hastings. No, something, or someone, interrupted the transformation. He rose suddenly and approached the steward, requesting access to the waste compartments near the galley. The young man hesitated, then complied, leading us down the narrow aisle to the rear of the aircraft. With gloved hands, Poirot began inspecting the refuse bins, not for what was present, but for what had once been there. At first, it seemed fruitless. Empty drink cartons, used napkins, a lipstick-stained tissue. But in the bottom of the main compartment, beneath a crumpled layer of foil and wrappers, Poirot uncovered something, a jacket, a dark wool jacket, folded once and forced into the bin with unusual care. Carefully, he lifted it and examined the lining. Then he paused. There, near the inside pocket, was a stain, dark, tacky, unmistakable. Blood. Poirot's expression didn't change, but I saw it, the quiet confirmation. He requested gloves from the steward and laid the garment across a steel-prep counter. This, he said, belonged to Weiss. How can you be sure? Poirot reached into the jacket's breast pocket and removed a business card, creased, but legible. Otto Weiss. Zurich Defense Symposium. Delegate. Poirot set the card down gently. This confirms it, mon ami. He was not abducted, nor did he flee. He was silenced, and the silence was efficient. I swallowed hard. But where's the rest of him, Poirot? There's only one place aboard an aircraft where a body might remain unnoticed for a short while, Poirot murmured, but only temporarily. He gestured to the narrow lavatory door, which hours earlier had been reported jammed. We both turned as the steward stepped forward, nervously wiping his palms on his uniform. I had trouble unlocking that door earlier, he said. We thought it was just pressure issues. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Then we must try again. Moments later, with tools borrowed from the maintenance kit, the door was pried open. Inside, at the bottom of the waste chute beneath the lavatory sink, they found the final confirmation. A surgical glove, a torn fragment of fabric, and beneath the lining of the panel, traces of what the steward called unusual moisture. Poirot said nothing for a long moment. Then softly, he whispered, It was not the thunder of a gun that killed Otto Weiss, Hastings. It was the soundless thrust of something colder, something designed to vanish before landing. I stared at him. But how? Poirot glanced toward the galley's freezer unit. Hastings, he said, have you ever heard of a weapon made of ice? The idea seemed mad. But Poirot's tone was not one of speculation, it was certainty. In a closed system, he continued, ice is the perfect assassin's blade. It pierces, it melts, and then it is nothing. And the killer? Poirot turned and began to walk back to our seats. "He's still here," he said, "surrounded by those who suspect each other. But I suspect no longer. I see the shape now. The motive. The method." He tapped his temple once, lightly. "The answer is near Hastings. It lies not in what we've seen, but in what we've been meant to miss." And with that, he returned to his notes as the cabin dimmed, the engine hum deepened, and the murder at 40,000 feet began, ever so slowly, to descend toward resolution. The cabin had descended into a strange hush, not one of comfort, but of restraint, like the final stillness before a storm. The lights overhead, now dimmed for landing procedures, cast long blue shadows along the carpeted aisle. Engines hummed like a distant pulse beneath our feet, and yet the tension inside the aircraft felt louder than any machinery. I watched passengers shift, breathe, avoid one another's gaze. But Poirot, he stood like a man already seeing the end. His eyes, sharp beneath the polished curve of his brow, were no longer observing, but readying. I knew that look. I had seen it before, on mist-laced moors, in candlelit parlors, and in locked carriages, where blood had been spilled. Hercule Poirot had reached his conclusion. He moved slowly toward the front of the cabin, as if each step was part of a ritual. At the curtain separating first class from the cockpit corridor, he turned and faced us, passengers, stewards, officers. Even the silence leaned forward to hear him speak. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice warm but heavy, like a velvet curtain drawn across a darkened stage. "Tonight, you have each endured a most harrowing journey, not merely across the Atlantic, but across something far more fragile, the illusion of safety. A man has been killed among us, Herr Otto Weiss, and while the world below us turned silently in the dark, his life was taken in a most deliberate, methodical way, not by accident, not by passion, but by calculation." He paused. The ripple in the air was unmistakable. Every passenger looked up. Poirot folded his hands neatly before him. "The question we must ask is not merely who had the reason to end his life, but who possessed the discipline to do so without a trace." He began to walk the aisle, pausing with precision at each name. "Miss Elena Weiss, you last saw your uncle alive. Your grief is real, but your presence at the time of death was not." She nodded tightly, lips pressed to silence. "Dr. Renaud, your disdain for the victim was evident. You once denounced his scientific papers as propaganda, but you were far from him that night. Your outrage is not guilt." The doctor's eyes burned, but he did not speak. Poirot passed by Lord and Lady Whitcomb. "You feared exposure, yes. You feared what Otto might leak. But you feared scandal more than prison. Your fear made you silent, not violent." Then came Rupert Glass, the historian. Poirot glanced only briefly at him. "You are too terrified by the past to dare become part of it again." And then he stopped, midway through the cabin, before Major Carter. "You," Poirot said quietly, "feared more than any of them, because you knew Otto Weiss was not bluffing. You knew he had the documents, proof that you, Major, had misused your company's influence to orchestrate private arms deals. Rosenfeld, Istanbul, even Caracas. Your whole career built upon clean uniforms and dirty ledgers." Major Carter blinked once. Then again. A long breath escaped him, but he said nothing. Poirot turned slowly toward the others. "Let us discuss, then, the murder." He gestured to the steward Andrews, who wheeled the drink cart forward under police escort. Poirot opened a waist compartment and carefully extracted a sealed plastic pouch. Inside, a piece of damp cloth, stained faintly red. "This," Poirot said, holding it up, "is the cloth used to stabilize the murder weapon. A dagger, crafted not from steel, but from ice, carved within the aircraft's galley freezer, narrow and sharp. Its handle was a coffee stirrer or something similar, wrapped in cloth for grip, a cloth torn from a monogrammed handkerchief. The monogram, an embroidered MR, was unmistakable. Poirot's voice softened, but the chill in it was undeniable. The very same initials carried by Major Carter, a man trained in survival, a man who once attended Arctic drills in Norway, a man whose guide, the unnamed third person in the photograph discovered in the cargo hold, specialized in indigenous ice hunting. Major Carter shifted. This is circumstantial. Poirot smiled gently. Is it? You see, monsieur, I also found the remnants of a frozen mold in the lavatory vent, now melted, but with enough frost traces to support my theory. You used the turbulence to your advantage. When the aircraft shook, and eyes were turned away, you moved. You approached Otto Weiss in his seat. You struck him, precisely, silently, and let the ice do its final trick. Poirot paused. It disappeared. The cabin was still. No one even breathed. But you, Major, you made one error, Poirot said softly. You discarded the bloodied cloth in haste. And you preserved its twin, your matching handkerchief, in your pocket even after I watched you sweat profusely during the second turbulence. Why did you not use it? The Major swallowed, and I saw the first shimmer of collapse in his expression. Poirot's gaze narrowed. Because you could not risk destroying the match. But I did not need the full set. Just a fiber. Just a weave. Egyptian cotton. Custom. Your tailor confirmed this morning. At the captain's signal, two marshals stepped forward. Major Carter did not resist. His voice was low, hoarse. He was going to destroy me. One document, just one, and I'd be ruined. I had nothing else. You had a choice, Poirot said, unmoved. And you chose silence, by the blade of melting ice. As the Major was led past us, down the aisle and toward the waiting authorities on the ground, the other passengers remained seated in stunned silence. Some looked down, others out the window toward the twinkling skyline of New York. But none met each other's eyes. Poirot returned to his seat, finally exhaling. His voice dropped into a murmur meant only for me. Murder, Hastings, is never the end of a man's path. It is merely the point at which he chooses a darker road. Outside, the aircraft taxied toward the terminal. Inside, the weight of justice had already landed. The wheels had touched tarmac, yet the air inside the cabin remained suspended, as if we were still 30,000 feet above the world, where reason had thinned with the oxygen. Outside, emergency vehicles flanked the aircraft, their lights a rotating dance of red and blue against the polished metal of the fuselage. Inside, silence ruled. A heavy, collective hush had settled over the passengers like a frost. Even the rustling of papers, the clink of glassware, those minor sounds of flight, had ceased entirely. All eyes, in secret or in defiance, were on Hercule Poirot. He sat unmoved, gaze fixed out the window, arms folded gently across his chest. Not a muscle stirred. It was, I had learned long ago, the moment after the hunt, when the beast had been cornered, subdued, and the forest quieted in reverent fear of what had been uncovered. Maxwell Reed had been led away. A monogrammed handkerchief, a melting blade of ice, a motive rooted in ruin. His silence during the arrest said more than confession ever could. Yet Poirot had not celebrated. There was no trace of satisfaction in his expression, only gravity, a solemn stillness, as though the detective mourned not only the loss of a life, but the collapse of all things civilized that had permitted such an act to take place in silence, in flight, among polite company. The captain, calm and courteous, addressed the passengers over the speaker system, instructing them to remain seated while authorities began their investigation. No one moved. No one dared. Lady Westholm sat stiffly, her gloved hands trembling now that the performance was over. Beside her, Elaine Carrington leaned back in her seat, as though exhaustion had finally overtaken whatever strength her fury had provided. Professor Finch was scribbling quietly in a leather notebook, whether it was his archaeological observations or a defense of logic against emotion, I couldn't say. Diana Leverson clutched the edges of her scarf again, now not to hide anything, but to occupy her fingers before they betrayed her composure. And Dr. Winters, his reputation, now shadowed by association, stared at nothing, lips slightly parted, as if he were still formulating rebuttals that would never be spoken. Outside, the police boarded. Calmly, quietly, Poirot rose at last. He did not speak. He simply stepped into the aisle and made his way forward, past each row of seats. His shoulders did not hunch. His chin did not lower. And yet the air around him felt somehow heavier, as though he carried not only the weight of the truth, but of every silence it had broken. He stepped onto the boarding stairs, into the cool night air. I followed. The tarmac was bathed in stark light, searchlights, police lamps, camera flashes from distant terminals. But in the midst of it stood Poirot, untouched by spectacle. The New York police detective assigned to the case approached him with notepad in hand, ready to collect names, timelines, statements. Poirot handed him a small leather folder. "Inside," he said gently, "you will find a complete reconstruction of the crime. Timeline, materials used, disposal method, motive, and supporting evidence. The rest, mon ami, is a matter of law. I have merely provided the story." The officer blinked. "That's thorough." Poirot offered a polite bow. "I am Belgian, monsieur. We pride ourselves on precision." As the officer turned away, I remained beside Poirot, unsure if we were free to leave or expected to give further statements. But Poirot simply gazed up toward the stars, where the flight path still glimmered faintly in the sky. "They all wore masks, Hastings," he said at last. "Each of them. Grief, bitterness, failure, envy. But masks are not difficult to read when they begin to crack." "You always knew it was Reed?" Poirot shook his head. "I suspected, but I did not know until I saw what he chose not to touch." He did not need to explain. The handkerchief, preserved even in panic, the one gesture too careful to be innocent. "Still," I murmured, "to plan such a thing, with ice of all things, it seems impossible." Poirot turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "That is the brilliance of despair, mon ami. It turns even the most fragile substance into a weapon, if it believes it has no other choice." From the aircraft, passengers began to descend. Their eyes no longer darted or accused, but looked only downward, toward the ground that now felt more uncertain than the air had ever been. The sky had been cruel, yes, but what lay below was something far more difficult, the continuation of ordinary life, now tinged with the extraordinary. As we walked together toward the terminal, Poirot slowed beside a row of blinking runway lights. "A man builds a company," he said, "builds it for decades. And then, when it begins to slip, he decides to protect it not with courage, but with murder. And he believes, truly believes, that if the weapon vanishes, the crime itself shall dissolve." He turned toward me. "But nothing truly vanishes, Hastings. Not blood, not guilt, not even melted ice." And with that, we stepped into the terminal. The world welcomed us with fluorescent lights, quiet music, and the cold breath of morning. A new day, but no clean slate. The terminal was eerily quiet as we entered. Morning had not yet fully claimed the horizon, and the sterile glow of the arrival lounge felt at odds with the heaviness we carried from the sky. Somewhere beyond the sliding glass doors, New York stirred, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded above its skyline. But for Hercule Poirot, the case was not yet closed. Not truly. Not until the final emotional thread had been pulled taut and examined. We were guided by airport security to a private arrivals hall where the passengers were temporarily held for debriefing. The room was vast, lined with pale marble columns and rows of sterile seats. Here, everything echoed, footsteps, whispers, the rustling of papers, as if the room itself demanded reverence for what had transpired. Poirot moved slowly, his gaze shifting not just from face to face, but to how each person occupied their seat, how they avoided or sought eye contact, where their hands rested when they thought no one was looking. These were the final signs, the final movements of a performance whose curtain had already fallen, but whose cast had not yet left the stage. Elaine Carrington sat apart from the others, her posture regal, her eyes dry but haunted. When Poirot approached her, she met his gaze not with resistance, but with resignation. "You were never going to accuse me," she said quietly. Poirot inclined his head. "Non, madam, because you had already passed your verdict on yourself." She looked down at her hands, clenched tightly in her lap. "I knew something was coming. Victor never said it, but I could see it in the way he watched Maxwell, the way he'd stopped speaking about the company. He was preparing to dismantle the empire, but I never believed he would die for it." Poirot studied her face. "You mourn him, but not as a wife. As a witness." She nodded, her jaw tightening. He was many things, Monsieur Poirot. Brilliant, cold, controlling, but not a fool. He knew who Reed truly was, and I suspect he let him board that plane knowing it might be the end. Poirot's brow furrowed. That, madam, is a dangerous theory. Dangerous, she repeated, but fitting. He said nothing more. For some truths, silence was the only respectful answer. A few paces away, Professor Finch was pacing, muttering to himself as if constructing an argument against ghosts. Poirot did not interrupt him. Instead, he turned to Lady Westholme and her husband, who sat stiffly side by side, whispering in the restrained panic of people whose legacy had almost been stained. You feared financial ruin, Poirot said softly, but what you feared more was disgrace. Lord Westholme bristled. We had no knowledge of Maxwell's actions. Our investments were tied to his. Poirot interrupted gently. And you feared that guilt, even by association, would soil your name. You were willing to look away, until it was no longer possible. Lady Westholme lowered her eyes. I thought he might stop, that it was just desperation. Desperation often walks hand in hand with ambition, madam, Poirot replied, and together they leave destruction in their path. Diana Leverson, meanwhile, sat alone near the far corner, her scarf now coiled in her lap, revealing the silver pendant she had tried so long to conceal. When Poirot approached her, she offered a weary smile. I loved Victor once, she said before he could speak. Briefly, recklessly. He chose power. I chose distance. And yet you returned. I wanted to see him one last time, to see if he had changed. Did he? She hesitated, then shook her head. No, but I had. Poirot offered no judgment. Some choices, he knew, took decades to understand. At last, he approached Dr. Winters, who was seated with his hands clasped tightly around a leather medical bag. You knew, Poirot said quietly. Not what Reed had done, but what he was capable of. I suspected, Winters admitted, but I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was projecting. I wanted to believe we were all past the age of betrayal. Poirot's voice softened. We are never past betrayal, Doctor. Only past denial. The morning light began to pierce the high windows. The mood shifted slightly as the reality of the day crept in. Statements would be taken, headlines written, lives returned to their usual disguises. But for Poirot, the final piece was still unsaid. He turned to me. Hastings, he murmured. Do you know what fascinates me most about this crime? What's that? It was designed not merely to conceal the weapon, but to melt the guilt. Reed believed that if no blade was found, the act would vanish with the water. But murder, mon ami, is not so easily washed away. I nodded, and yet it nearly worked. Oui, Poirot agreed, because when the world moves too quickly, at 40,000 feet, no less, truth is often the first casualty. But not today. He stepped toward the door, ready to leave. The authorities had what they needed. Justice, in its clinical form, would now proceed. But Poirot, ever the custodian of the human soul, had already delivered a deeper justice, the restoration of memory, of motive, of consequence, of the hidden faces behind a smiling photograph, of silence that had frozen into a weapon. We stepped into the day. The cabin had grown still, eerily still, as the lights of New York began to glitter below, like a city made of stars. Through the oval windows of Flight 321, the skyline shimmered against the velvet dark, rising from the horizon like a silent promise. But inside the aircraft, tension coiled around every seatbelt, every breath, every gaze that refused to meet another. The flight was nearing its end, yet for Hercule Poirot, the world's most meticulous detective, the most crucial descent was still to come, not from the air to the ground, but from a mountain of lies into a valley of truth. Captain Hargrove had announced landing preparations just minutes ago, his voice calm but firm, echoing through the intercom. But then, at Poirot's subtle request, the routine had been interrupted. A final gathering was called. The passengers, now suspects and witnesses in equal measure, were asked to return to their original seats, recreating the tableau from the very moment the fatal blow had struck Victor Carrington. The scene was set not just for landing, but for revelation. Poirot rose slowly from his seat, brushing the creases from his immaculate suit, his expression composed. Yet his eyes, those small, sharp, glistening marbles, were alive with fire. The same fire I had seen in him before every great unmasking, that sacred moment where illusion falls away and only truth remains. He stepped into the aisle as the aircraft began a slow descent through the clouds. The passengers turned toward him, some with curiosity, others with dread. No one spoke. Only the gentle roar of the engines remained. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice low but clear, rich with its unmistakable Belgian accent. For the past several hours, we have traveled together at 40,000 feet, suspended between heaven and earth, carried forward not just by wings, but by secrets. He looked slowly from face to face. A man has died. Victor Carrington, a financier of vast power, influence, and ambition. But in this cabin, this very room in the sky, he was brought low, not by nature nor machine, but by human hands. The passengers shifted. I could see perspiration glistening on some brows, hands gripping armrests a little tighter. Poirot continued, his tone like silk drawn over steel. We were faced with an impossible crime. A man stabbed in the heart. No sign of struggle. No trace of weapon. Surrounded by passengers, by attendants, and yet, none who saw the hand that struck. A ghost, perhaps, or a murderer too clever for the naked eye. He began to walk the aisle slowly, hands clasped behind his back. But nothing, Mes Amos, nothing escapes the little gray cells. The murder weapon was indeed invisible, because it no longer exists. Gasps broke out. Someone audibly muttered, "Impossible." Poirot held up a small cloth-wrapped bundle, the very bag retrieved from the galley trash. The weapon, you see, was fashioned from ice. A dagger of frozen water, shaped in the freezer compartment during boarding, with a simple wooden handle wrapped in cloth for grip. A blade that could kill, and then vanish, melting into nothing. A silence fell over the cabin. The impossible had become tangible. And when did our killer strike? Poirot raised an eyebrow. During the turbulence, when chaos reigned, when attention was drawn elsewhere and vision blurred. He turned now to Maxwell Reed. The man sat hunched, pale, his monogrammed handkerchief peeking neatly from his pocket. Poirot's voice dropped, soft, surgical. "Mr. Reed, you created the weapon. You knew the science, the temperature controls, the conditions for concealment. The photograph we found of you, Carrington, and a third man, was torn to hide your Arctic guide, the very man who taught you survival and silence." Reed's lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. Poirot continued, unwavering. "You retrieved the weapon from its hiding place, perhaps hidden in your briefcase, or even within the lavatory. You plunged it into Carrington's chest while the aircraft shook. The noise covered the sound. The chaos masked the motion. And you returned to your seat as the ice began to dissolve, leaving only a silent wound." Poirot stepped aside as Andrews, the steward, brought forward the drink cart. Poirot opened the receptacle, drawing out the blood-stained scrap. "You disposed of the cloth in the coffee bin, thinking it safe. But the fibers remained, and they match your Egyptian cotton handkerchiefs precisely. A thread, monsieur, leads always back to the hand that wove it." Reed's hands trembled. "You can't prove anything," he whispered. "There's no knife, no witness. It's circumstantial." Poirot turned, calm and clear. "Perhaps, but there is more. Carrington had uncovered your embezzlement. The Operation Icarus project was a cover, a name in his notebook, meant not for finance, but for fraud. He planned to expose you the moment we landed. You had no choice, at least, you believed so. But you were wrong. There's always choice. There is always another way." Reed slowly bowed his head, his breath shallow. "He betrayed me," he murmured. "I built the company. 30 years. And he wanted to destroy it over a spreadsheet. I did what I had to." Poirot did not blink. "And now, monsieur, you must live with what you chose." At the captain's signal, the police officers stepped forward, moving silently to either side of Reed. He did not resist. As he was led away, no one applauded. No one sighed. The air in the cabin was too heavy for such things. The lights of New York grew brighter now, like truth rising from the dark. I turned to Poirot. "So that's it then?" He nodded, watching the runway approach. "Yes, Hastings. The murder was brilliant, but it was not perfect. There is no perfect crime, not when memory holds, when guilt rises, and when reason walks the aisle with quiet shoes." The wheels touched down with a squeal. Flight 321 had landed, but we knew, as did everyone else in that cabin, that the real descent had happened in the hearts of men, and one of them had fallen, not from the sky, but from grace.